What are bosons? How are they connected to the four fundamental forces? Before answering that question, we need to dismantle an image. For decades, science communication has taught us to imagine particles as tiny little balls bouncing off one another. The electron as a marble, the photon as a pebble of light. That image is comfortable, but it's misleading. And when we reach bosons, it breaks completely. A boson is not a little ball. It is closer to a pattern, like a wave in the sea, a form of organization. To understand what that means, we first need to talk about the field. The field, the medium from which everything emerges. Imagine that space is not empty. That instead of being an inert container in which things happen, it is itself an active medium, a nodal network like the water of an ocean extending everywhere in every direction. In Primeon, the theoretical framework from which we will read physics, that medium is called the basal nodal field, the Primeonic field. This is not a metaphor. It is the central proposal. There exists a field that gives geometric structure to reality, and everything we observe, particles, forces, mass, matter, are ways in which that field organizes itself. And how does it organize itself? Through synchronies. A synchrony is a coherent pattern within the field, a rhythm that sustains itself, a dynamic structure that remains stable because the different nodes of the field coordinates one another in a pattern. And here is the idea that will guide this whole chapter. A boson is a synchrony, not a little ball, not a messenger with mass, a pattern of coherence in the field. And depending on how that pattern is organized, whether it propagates, whether it closes in a bidimensional pattern, whether it reorganizes in a tridimensional interiority, we obtain the different bosons known to physics. Let's go through them one by one, from the simplest to the most complex. The photon, the simplest synchrony. The photon is light. More precisely, it is the minimal unit of electromagnetic radiation, a photon. What travels from a star to your retina and what is exchanged when two charged particles interact. In the Standard Model, the most precise physical theory we have, the photon is the gauge boson of electromagnetism. In technical language, that means it is the carrier of the electromagnetic force. But that description does not tell us what the photon is. It only tells us what it does. From Primeon, the photon is the purest and simplest form of synchrony, a pattern that copies itself from node to node through the field, never closing back on itself, like a wave advancing through the ocean without ever forming a whirlpool. In our terminology is a 1D synchrony, a pattern that travels the field in a line. This immediately explains two of its fundamental properties. It has zero mass because it does not form interiority. There is no enclosed volume, no boundary to maintain. The synchrony simply propagates, and it travels at the maximum possible speed, what we call the speed of light, because it is the nodal limit of transmission of the field. Nothing slows it down because nothing contains it. A photon can travel billions of light years without getting lost. It is pure propagating synchrony, long range and, in that sense, indefinitely persistent. The W and Z bosons, synchronies that close. Now, things get more complex and more interesting. There are two other types of bosons that physics discovered in the 1980s. The W bosons, actually two of them, W plus and W, and the Z boson. Together with the photon, they form what is called the electroweak sector, the set of particles that mediate both electromagnetism and the weak force. Unlike the photon, these bosons have mass and a lot of it. The Z boson weighs almost 90 times more than a proton. And their range is tiny. They act only at distances smaller than the atomic nucleus. Why are they so different from the photon if they are supposedly in the same family? Because their synchrony does not propagate freely. It closes. Imagine that instead of a wave advancing forward, you have a whirlpool spinning on itself. The coherence of the field no longer travels onward, it loops, recycles, and forms a local structure. In Primeon, we say it is a compact synchrony in 2 dimensions. The pattern organizes itself into a closed plane that interacts with the other 2 tridimensional planes. That closure has an energetic cost. Keeping coherence rotating requires something that free propagation does not: keep an interiority, field trapped and synchronized inside the energetic pattern, and that cost appears from the outside as mass. Now, why does the W have electric charge while the Z does not? Because of the geometry of the closure. In the W bosons, the recurrence has a preferred orientation. The pattern rotates more in one direction than in another. That asymmetry is what we call electric charge. W plus and W are the same type of closure, but with opposite orientations. In the Z boson, the rotation is distributed symmetrically across planes. There is no net orientation. That is why it is electrically neutral. Electric charge from Primeon is not a mysterious property glued onto particles. It is the geometric trace of how a closure is oriented. The Higgs field, the condition that makes mass possible. Here we arrive at one of the most important discoveries of 20th century physics, and also one of the most poorly explained. The Higgs field is often presented in popular science as a kind of invisible molasses that slows particles down and gives them mass. It is an image that sort of works, but it obscures more than it clarifies. Let's try something more precise. We have seen that the photon has no mass because its synchrony propagates without closing. We have seen that the W and Z bosons have mass because their synchrony forms closures in 2 dimensions, and from there operates in the spatial planes. What happens when synchrony manages to close in all 3 spatial dimensions? Something new appears: volumetric interiority, a pattern that does not merely rotate in a plane, but encloses a volume, a bubble of coherence with a genuine inside and outside. The Higgs field is precisely the condition, the nodal architecture of the medium that makes this 3-dimensional closure possible. It is not an extra particle pushing on the others. It is the state of the field that opens the door to a new organizational regime in 3 planes at once. Physicists describe it using the concept of the vacuum expectation value, which sounds intimidating but simply means this: the Higgs field is not zero in empty space. It has a background value, constant and ubiquitous, and that background value, that nodal structure, is what allows certain synchronies to acquire stable 3-dimensional structure. When a particle couples to the Higgs field in standard language, what happens in Primeonic language is this: its synchrony enters the regime in which it can organize itself with stable volumetric interiority. The 3-dimensional boundary appears as a structural consequence of that coupling. And that maintained interiority is what, from the outside, we observe as mass. The particle does not receive mass from outside, like receiving a package. It enters a regime in which its own structure can stabilize in 3 dimensions. The Higgs boson, the pulse of the threshold. In 2012, CERN announced one of the most anticipated discoveries in the history of physics. It had detected the Higgs boson, the particle predicted decades earlier by Peter Higgs and other physicists. What exactly is it? If the Higgs field is the medium that makes three-dimensional closure possible, the Higgs boson is the oscillation of that medium. It is what you get when you perturb the tridimensional Higgs field with enough energy, an excitation that lasts an instant before decaying, and that reveals the existence of the underlying field. It is like striking the surface of a lake to prove that water is there. The Higgs boson is the wave that proves the medium exists. In Primeonic terms, it is the oscillation of the regime that enables volumetric interiority. The experimental evidence that this threshold between massless synchrony and massive synchrony is real, physical, and measurable. The gluon, synchrony within synchrony. Once the field can generate stable three-dimensional interiority, something can appear that did not exist before. Systems with internal subsystems. Hadrons, protons and neutrons, the building blocks of the atomic nucleus, are precisely that. Inside each proton there are 3 quarks, particles that are never found free in nature. They are permanently confined within the hadron's boundary. What maintains that internal coherence? What makes the quark stay inside? We call it gluons. In the Standard Model, gluons are the bosons of the strong force, the mediators of quantum chromodynamics, or QCD. But that description presents them as messengers, like photons going back and forth between quarks. From Primeon, the picture is different and richer. Gluons are the internal synchrony of the three-dimensional system. Inside the system, there are 3 quarks and tridimensional field, confined. The gluons are not messengers traveling outward. They are the coherence dynamics of the internal field that maintains consistency among the quarks inside the shared boundary. Most of the proton's mass, around 90%, does not come from the quarks themselves, but from the energy of the confined field, the internal synchrony of the triad. Physicists use the word color to describe the charge of the strong force. There are 3 colors for quarks: red, green, blue by convention. And hadrons are always colorless, combinations that sum to 0 net color. From Primeon, color is not a strange metaphor. It is a degree of internal coherence of the three-dimensional system. And the hadron's color neutrality is simply the condition for stable closure. A hadron is a superclosure. Quarks as subsystems with their own structure. Gluons as the synchrony that keeps them coherent within a shared boundary. The 4 forces, 1 field, 4 regimes. Standard physics describes 4 fundamental forces: electromagnetism, the weak force, the strong force, and gravity. 4 interactions, 4 families of mediator particles, 4 sets of equations. From a Primeon, that multiplicity is apparent. There are not 4 independent forces. There is a single field organizing itself in 4 distinct synchrony regimes. Electromagnetism is the long-range propagating synchrony regime. The photon is its natural mode. When 2 particles with electric charge approach one another, their synchrony patterns begin to couple. If they are in phase, they attract. If they are in antiphase, they repel. The electromagnetic force is, at bottom, interference or reinforcement between synchronies. The weak force is the electroweak transition regime from a higher complexity system to a lower complexity system. It does not stabilize structures. When a particle loses its internal synchrony, decay into a simpler organization. This is what we see in processes such as beta decay, where a neutron becomes a proton while emitting an electron and an antineutrino. The W and Z bosons are its mediators. The weak force is the mechanism by which the field enables reconfigurations between different synchrony states. The strong force is the internal synchrony of three-dimensional closure. Gluons are its expression. It is intense because it acts directly at the level of interiority of the superclosure, and therefore it rapidly decreases with distance, is the internal cohesion of the system. Gravity is the geometric response of the field to the presence of stable three-dimensional interiority. Where there is mass, where there is sustained volumetric closure, the field curves. And that curvature is what we experience as gravitational attraction. Gravity is always attractive because it responds to the positive volume of interiority. There is no negative interiority. The complete hierarchy. From the photon to gravity, everything fits into a single progression. The field begins in the simplest regime, free propagation, and through progressively more complex closures reaches stable volumetric interiority. Each level emerges from the previous one. Nothing is added arbitrarily. The photon is synchrony that travels. The W and Z bosons are synchrony that closes in 2 dimensions. The Higgs field is the condition that enables three-dimensional closure. The Higgs boson is the oscillation that reveals that threshold. Gluons are the synchrony that keeps complex three-dimensional systems coherent. And gravity is the geometry the field adopts in response to all that closure. One field, one grammar. Ever richer regimes of organization. And when that three-dimensional closure becomes persistent and stable, real mass appears. From mass emerge nuclei, from nuclei atoms, from atoms molecules, and from molecules, given enough time and the right conditions, something that can read these lines and ask what it is made of.